The desert didn't howl. It whispered, slow and hollow, like it had forgotten how to carry sound. The wind brushed past the cracked ridges and brittle bones of old shrubs, lifting specks of sand into the sky like prayers that never reached heaven. Somewhere between the last coyote's cry and the sun's cruel rise, she lay there, half buried, half alive. Her body had given more than it had to give. Pale, sunburned, lips split, dress stiff with salt and milk and blood. Arms curled around two tiny bundles, one pressed tight to her chest, the other tucked beneath her tattered skirt, his whimpers barely louder than the wind. Her breath came shallow, soft, and far between. Her eyelids fluttered like moth wings, lashes thick with grit. Every so often, a tear traced a line down the grime on her cheek, not from pain but from the weight of holding on. No one would have seen her if not for the boy. He wasn't a hero, just a child chasing a runaway goat across the flatlands. Barefoot, freckled, a sliver of wildness in his eyes. He saw the scrap of white against the earth and thought it a bone. But when he crept closer, he saw fingers. Not stiff. Not blue. Moving. She opened her eyes once, just once, and saw him, backlit by sun, squinting. He looked like someone she might have dreamed once, long ago. She couldn't speak, only moved her hand, a twitch, and the boy ran. She didn't know if he would come back. She didn't know if she'd last long enough to find out. Her mind drifted. She was not born for this land. She came with a wagon and a husband and too much hope. The land burned it out of her quick. The journey west was hard. The baby was harder. The second baby was a surprise, and that made it a problem. Her husband had always wanted a son. One son. A namesake. Not two mewling mouths. Not when the grain hadn't sprouted and the riverbed turned to stone. Not when all the good land was gone, and he'd grown bitter from chasing fortune into sand. He didn't strike her. Not with fists. Just with silence. With decisions made alone. They had argued. That last morning, when she still bled from birth and sat dizzy with heat, he'd said, "I can't carry four of us." She thought it a joke. Then he loaded his things. Took the mule. Took the canteen. Didn't take her. She'd crawled half the day before her legs gave out. Then night came, and she shivered, skin-fevered. The babies cried. She couldn't feed them. Her milk had dried like the land. But she still sang. Not loudly. Just a low hum. Something her mother used to sing when storms came close. A lullaby to keep the wolves from her door. A lullaby for children who didn't know they were dying. And now the wind was answering her, soft, warm, and hooved. The boy returned, and behind him rode a man. She couldn't lift her head to see him clearly. Only saw a hat, wide-brimmed, a shape against the sun, then shadow over her face. He dismounted slowly, like someone who didn't like sudden movements. Boots crunched beside her ear. He knelt. She smelled leather, smoke, and river dust. He didn't speak. Just looked. Her lips moved. She tried to form a word. Not for herself. For them. He reached first for the baby under the skirt, quiet, barely breathing, and cradled him in one hand like something sacred. Then the second, the one on her chest, slick with fever sweat. Then her. He wrapped all three in his duster and lifted her with a grunt, slow and careful. She didn't weigh much anymore. Her head dropped against his chest, but she heard it, the steady beat of his heart. The soft murmur of something, maybe a prayer. Maybe not. He laid her across the saddle, held the babies in a cloth sling across his body, and walked. She didn't remember the ride. Didn't remember the sky, or the ground moving beneath her. Just that warmth. That she was warm for the first time in days. When she opened her eyes again, it was night. She was inside. Not a house, a cabin. One room. Cedar walls. Low fire. A bed made of furs and wool. She was in it. She turned her head. Her neck ached like stone. The babies were beside her, swaddled and asleep. Their breathing shallow, but steady. There was a bottle, glass, old, beside them. Goat milk, she guessed. Someone had fed them, cleaned them, wrapped their feet. She blinked. There was a chair near the hearth. A man sat there, still in his hat, elbows on knees, head down, hands clasped like he was waiting for something to arrive. She wanted to ask who he was, why he'd done this. What kind of man took in a stranger with 2 babes and no name? But her voice was gone. She watched the firelight flicker over his face. He looked younger than she'd guessed, though worn like river rock. His eyes were not the kind that had seen little. They were the kind that had seen too much and didn't need to look again to remember. He felt her gaze, lifted his head. They didn't speak. He stood, stepped over quietly, looked at the babies, then at her. She tried to rise, to sit up, but he placed a hand on her shoulder. Just the weight of it was enough to still her. Not firm. Not forceful. Just calm. She let herself fall back into the furs. Her hand found her son's, and she wept. Not loud. Not desperate. Just water returning to places long dried up. The man stepped away, poured water into a wooden bowl, and brought it to her lips. She drank. Slowly. Every drop felt like it healed something. Then he turned. Walked back to the fire. Saturday. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. This silence held breath. Held choice. She stared at the timbered ceiling, and for the first time since being left in the sand, she believed in waking up. The fire cracked once, like a closing line in a story not yet done. And far off, the wind didn't sound so lonely anymore. The days that followed were stitched together by stillness and the low sounds of survival, water ladled from a kettle, the soft hush of cloth wiping fevered skin, the faint suckling of the babies as their mouths remembered how to live. The woman slept in fits, her body reclaiming lost ground, drifting between pain and peace like a reed floating downstream. But she was no longer adrift. There was a rhythm now. A quiet order to things. The man had not told her his name. He didn't offer it, and she hadn't yet found her voice to ask. But she watched him. Through half-lidded eyes and silent dawns, she learned his ways. He rose before the sun, slipping out the cabin door like a shadow returning to dust. When he returned, he smelled of early dew and goat's milk. He brought herbs, wild and bitter, that he boiled into a tonic she drank without protest. He carried firewood on his back, stacked it with care, as if each log mattered. And he always checked the babies first, pressing the back of his fingers to their cheeks, adjusting the swaddle, tucking a blanket tighter when the wind shifted. He moved as if the world had taught him to be gentle. Through loss or labor, it wasn't clear. His eyes held the stillness of someone who'd long ago stopped expecting things to get easier. By the 3rd morning, her fever broke. She woke with sweat soaking her dress, hair clinging to her temples. She sat up too fast and the room spun like a turning wagon wheel. But the babies were there, warm, alive, red-cheeked and cooing. That alone made her cry again. The man appeared in the doorway with a tin bowl of oats and a wooden spoon. He paused when he saw her upright. Then nodded once and handed her the bowl. Her hands trembled. She managed 2 spoonfuls before setting it aside. He didn't speak. Just took the bowl, poured water into her cup, and held it out. She drank in slow gulps, and when she handed it back, she met his gaze for the first time since she'd opened her eyes days ago. He didn't look away. But there was no demand in his stare, no question. Just a calm acceptance, like he already knew the worst parts of her story and didn't need it retold. That evening she spoke her first words since the desert. "Thank you?" It rasped from her throat like wind through a broken flute. Still, it was whole. Still, it was hers. He didn't answer. Just stirred the stew in his pot and nodded. She watched the way he moved, the way he gave her space without absence. He never hovered. Never touched her without reason. But his presence was steady, like the weight of the earth beneath the cabin. She slept deeply that night, her arm draped across both boys. In her dreams, she was walking through tall grass barefoot, no burden in her arms, no blood on her dress. Just wind, and songbirds, and a man walking behind her with silence on his heels. Morning brought with it the scent of fresh bread, dense, slightly burned. He tried. She smiled. He caught the smile. Didn't return it, but she saw something soften behind his eyes, like dust lifting from old glass. Later, he offered her a blanket and motioned toward the front steps. She wrapped it around her shoulders and followed him outside. The porch was worn smooth by weather and time. She sat on a stump, careful not to jostle the twins sleeping against her chest. He leaned against the rail, sipping coffee from a metal cup. The land stretched out in all directions, dull gold, red clay, scattered scrub. A hawk circled high overhead, hunting shadows. The wind was dry but not cruel today. She looked at him. Studied the lines at the corners of his eyes. Not age, she realized. Sorrow. She cleared her throat. You live alone? He nodded. Always. He was quiet for a beat. Then, not always. She waited. But that was all he gave. Still, she understood. Loss recognized itself. He turned slightly, arms folded. You were left. It wasn't a question. She nodded anyway. With 2 newborns, he added, as if still trying to understand how anyone could. My husband, she said, voice steady now, decided he didn't need us more than he needed a meal and half a barrel of water. The cowboy didn't respond. She stared out over the dry hills. He told me he'd be back. But I saw how he didn't look at me. He wasn't coming back. A long silence passed between them. Then, quietly, he said, You looked like someone no one should leave behind. The words were plain. Not meant to impress. Not even meant to comfort. But they struck something deep in her, some hidden place where grief and grace were still tangled. She turned away so he wouldn't see the tears in her eyes. That night, he brought the babies a cradle, built from scrap wood, sanded smooth, with a faded quilt at the bottom. She ran her hand over the edge, marveling at how the world could still offer gentleness. Did you make this? She asked. He didn't answer. Just carried it to the bedside and set it down without a word. She laid the boys in, side by side, and for the first time, her arms were empty without feeling alone. When she lay down, the firelight danced on the walls. Outside, an owl called once and then went silent. The man sat in his chair by the hearth, coat draped over his lap, hat on his knee. He seemed to keep watch, not just over her but over the silence itself, as if guarding it from shattering. She turned her face toward him. You have a name? He nodded slowly. Elias. She breathed it like a secret. Elias. And though he didn't ask hers, she gave it anyway. Clara. He looked up at her. Met her gaze. A small nod? No more. But something passed between them then. A shift in the quiet. Not love, not yet, but respect. A fragile trust taking root. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her again, deeper this time. There was no fear at her back, no sorrow clawing for her throat. Just Elias sitting by the fire, and her son sleeping beside her, and the hush of a place that had not yet learned how to break what it had barely begun to mend. And outside, the wind moved softer across the plain. Spring came quietly to the desert. Not with bloom or thunder, but in a soft, almost unnoticeable warmth of morning light, the longer pause between night winds, the subtle rise of birdsong from the cottonwoods near the dry creek. Clara sat on the porch most mornings now, one twin at her breast, the other nestled in a sling across her chest. Her hair had begun to shine again, sunlit and combed back, and her cheeks held a faint color that hadn't been there when Elias first carried her in from the dust. She had not returned to who she was before. That woman, young, afraid to speak too loudly, living by the rhythm of someone else's steps, was gone. What sat on that porch each day was someone new. Someone scraped clean by fire and sand, stitched back together by silence, and the steady kindness of a stranger. Elias moved about the homestead with his usual quiet, fixing fences, gathering wild herbs, tending to the goat, who Clara had begun to call Lullabelle. He always returned by dusk, smelling faintly of mesquite smoke and sweat, placing whatever he'd found or mended on the porch beside her without needing to explain. He rarely spoke first, but he listened well. That had become the most sacred thing between them. How attentively he listened, as though her voice were a river he'd once lost and was grateful to find again. At night, they shared stew and bread. The twins would coo or cry, and Clara would rise without complaint, cradling them close, humming the soft songs of her childhood. Elias had once asked if she'd been taught music, and she'd laughed, saying no, only heartache and lullabies. He hadn't smiled, exactly, but the edge of his mouth had softened, and that was enough. Some evenings, he brought out a worn leather journal and would write by firelight, pausing now and then to stare into the flames like they might answer him. Clara never asked what he wrote. Some things weren't questions, they were just part of who a person was. One morning, she found a small bundle wrapped in cloth on the table, a pair of handmade shoes for the twins, no bigger than a closed fist. The stitching wasn't perfect. They looked awkward, like they'd been made by hands used to rifles, not needles. But she held them like they were gold. That night, she didn't say thank you. Instead, she laid one hand gently on Elias's shoulder when she passed him, and he turned his face just slightly, eyes closed for the briefest moment, as if memorizing the warmth. They didn't touch again for days, but something had changed in the air between them. It was not romantic, not yet, and perhaps not ever. It was more like two souls that had stopped looking past each other and started turning toward. Clara began helping with the chores, slowly at first. Gathering eggs from the coop, drawing water, folding washed linens in the breeze. Her legs were stronger now. She laughed once when she nearly tripped over a bucket, and the sound startled a hawk into flight. Elias looked up from across the yard and caught her eyes. They held the glance a second too long. Later, while she was hanging clothes, he approached with an old hammer and a strip of wood. "You need a line closer to the cabin," he said, eyes scanning the beams. She nodded. "I was thinking the same." He hammered in the nails, careful not to splinter the old wall. She handed him the rope, their fingers brushing briefly. He didn't look up, but he did pause before knotting it. That evening, they shared a quiet meal. The twins had fallen asleep early, their bellies full, their cheeks flushed with health. Clara took her seat near the fire and leaned back, eyes drifting to the crackling embers. She spoke softly. "I used to think kindness was a kind of weakness. Something folks did when they were afraid to fight." Elias didn't reply, but she could feel him listening. "But you," she paused, searching. "You do it different. Like it costs you something, but you give it anyway." He looked at the fire for a long moment before answering. "Kindness ain't weakness. It's just quieter than cruelty, so folks forget it's there." She turned toward him. "Was there someone who taught you that?" He nodded once. "My sister." There was weight in the name he didn't speak. Clara didn't press. Instead, she said, "I had a brother. Younger. He died of fever when I was 14. After that, I stopped singing for a long time." Elias glanced at her. "You sing now." She smiled. "Because I remembered I'm still here." There was a silence after that, soft, unhurried. The kind that didn't ask for more. One afternoon, a rider passed near the property. Young Dusty slouched low in his saddle. He looked over once, then kept riding toward the hills. Clara watched from the window. Elias stood behind her, watching too. There was no fear, not yet. But she noticed how Elias's hand moved toward the rifle resting by the door, fingers brushing the wood as though reacquainting. "Trouble?" she asked. "Maybe not," he said. "But word travels faster than horses in these parts." She understood. Her husband, ex-husband, now in every way but law, had left her out there, but that didn't mean he'd be content with silence. Men like him often mistook abandonment for ownership. That night, Elias added wood to the fire and moved his chair slightly closer to the door. Clara didn't ask why. She simply brought the twins' cradle nearer to her side of the bed and slept with one hand resting on its edge. The wind picked up in the dark hours. It wasn't storming, but it murmured through the slats like something that remembered. Clara dreamt she was in the desert again, alone, crawling with bleeding feet. She reached for the babies, but they slipped through her arms like smoke. Then Elias's voice called, not loud, just firm, and she woke to find her fingers clutching the wool blanket, breath shallow. Elias was still by the fire, eyes open, watching the coals. Their eyes met. You all right? He asked, voice low. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Bad dreams? He added. Yes. He didn't offer comfort, didn't speak soft lies. But he did rise, bring over a fresh log for the fire, and sit closer this time. Between them, the flames rose again, brighter, steadier. They said nothing more. But when Clara finally lay back down, her body eased. She fell asleep again, and this time, the dreams stayed away. By morning, the sky was pale blue, and the wind had died. Clara walked outside barefoot, the babies nestled in her arms. Elias followed at a distance, letting her move freely, but never out of reach. She stood at the edge of the porch, staring out across the land. It still looked barren in many ways, dusty, scarred, sun-bitten. But she knew now it wasn't empty. Things could grow here. Quietly. Without permission. She turned and looked back at Elias. I think I want to stay, she said. He didn't smile, but he nodded once, slowly. Then stay. It was a morning thick with heat and silence. The kind of silence that hung too long in the air, like a held breath before a storm. Clara felt it before she saw anything, a stillness in the birds, a pause in the wind. Even Lulabelle stayed close to the cabin, bleating low as if uncertain. She stood at the window with one twin cradled against her chest, eyes sweeping the trail that wound up from the south. Her fingers tightened instinctively on the child's back. Elias had gone to the well. He was still in view, a pale figure against the copper land. But Clara's eyes weren't on him. They were fixed on the wagon coming slow around the ridge, pulled by a tired mule, covered in canvas stained by travel and sun. And seated at the front, reins slack in his hands, was the ghost she thought she'd buried. He wore the same hat, the same half-scowl twisted into his face like it had been carved there. Her husband. Not dead. Not gone. Just late. And empty-handed. She didn't move. Her legs didn't shake. But something inside her retreated, some soft part she'd let grow back in the weeks since the desert. She breathed, slow and deep, and kissed her son's temple before setting him gently into the cradle. Elias had seen it now. He walked back with purpose, not speed, hands free, face unreadable. Clara stepped outside just as the wagon pulled to a halt beside the fence. The man climbed down like he'd never left anything behind. His boots hit the dust without apology. His eyes moved from Clara to Elias, measuring, calculating. He adjusted his coat like a man preparing for a sale. You've done well for yourself, he said, voice thin and dry. 2 babies still breathing. That's something. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. I come from my family, he added, more to Elias than to her. They're mine. Elias stepped forward, not close, just enough. You left them. I left them alive, the man shot back. That's more than most can say. He smiled then, a sharp little twist that had once convinced Clara to marry him when she didn't know any better. Now it looked like a wound that never healed right. Elias's voice was calm. They're not yours anymore. The man's smile faded. You think you can just take what don't belong to you? No, Elias said. I don't take. I protect. The man glanced back at his wagon like he had something worth using in there. But all he found was dust and rope. His bluff had nothing behind it. Clara watched the exchange from the porch, not moving, not blinking. She thought of all the nights Elias had sat awake near the fire, the way he'd rocked her sons when they cried, the way he had handed her silence like a gift instead of a punishment. And she remembered her husband's voice shouting in the dark, the ache of cold water poured from a distance, the long hours waiting for affection that never came. She walked down the steps slowly, barefoot, the hem of her skirt brushing the dry earth. She stopped beside Elias, not behind him. Her voice, when it came, was clear and still. You left me to die. Her husband looked at her then, for the first time. Not like property. Not like a problem. But with something closer to confusion. Like he hadn't expected her to speak. You said you'd come back. But you took the good mule and left the water low. You knew what would happen. I was gonna send help. He muttered, but even he didn't believe it. You never asked their names? Clara continued, voice steady. Not once. You never touched them. You never buried the afterbirth. You left before the blood even dried. His mouth opened, then shut. She could see it now. He hadn't come for love. He'd come for the right to be seen as a man again. And she'd stolen that from him by surviving. Elias said nothing. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood beside her, hands open, eyes locked on the other man like he was watching a dust devil cross the plains, loud, useless, and gone in a minute. The silence stretched until it snapped. The man turned. Climbed back into his wagon. This ain't over, he called behind him. Clara didn't reply. Elias watched him disappear down the trail, the wagon growing smaller, swallowed by distance. He waited until there was no dust left, no sound but the wind returning. Then he turned to Clara. She was pale, but standing tall. Her fists were clenched at her sides. He reached for her hand, not to lead, not to comfort, just to share in the weight. She let him hold it. Back inside, the baby stirred. She lifted them both into her arms, held them as one. She paced the cabin slowly, letting their warmth soothe her. That night they said little. Elias made supper. She fed the boys. The wind tapped gently at the shutters like it was checking if it could come in. She locked the door. They sat near the hearth again, a little closer than before. The fire cracked, slow and low. Outside, coyotes cried, far off, but not frightening. Clara leaned her head back against the wall and stared at the ceiling. Do you think he'll come back? She asked. Elias stirred the coals. Maybe. She nodded. He looked small today. He always was, Elias said. But now you can see it. She smiled faintly. I don't want to be afraid again. You're not, Elias said. You're just remembering how to stand. Her throat ached then, not from tears, but from how much she'd held in. She reached for the cradle and rocked it with one foot. The baby slept soundly, untouched by the world's ugliness. Later, before bed, Elias handed her a folded cloth. Inside was a piece of iron, small, shaped like a ring, but open at the seam. I don't need to own anything, he said. But if you stay, I'll protect what you choose. Clara ran her fingers over the cool metal. It wasn't beautiful. It was real. Solid. Forged by heat. She didn't answer that night. Just placed the ring on the windowsill, where the firelight could catch it. And the sky outside darkened slowly, gently, like it too was beginning to trust the dawn would come.